The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop outside Winnetka, California, throwing Juliet Sterling against the wooden seat so hard she tasted blood from where she had bitten her tongue. And when she stumbled out into the dusty afternoon of 1878, the first thing she did was smile at the group of rough-looking men who had stopped the coach and offer them water from her canteen, because she truly believed that kindness could soften any heart. "Well, would you look at this?" the leader said, his yellowed teeth showing through a grin that made the other passengers shrink back. "An angel descended right into our hands." Juliet extended the canteen further, her blue eyes bright with genuine concern. "You must be thirsty standing out here in this heat. Please help yourselves." The driver, an old-timer named Rusty who had seen 30 years on these routes, grabbed her arm and yanked her back. "Miss Sterling, get back in the coach right now." But Juliet had already stepped too far forward, and the leader snatched the canteen from her hand, his fingers deliberately brushing against hers in a way that made her finally realize something might be wrong. Still, she told herself she was being uncharitable, that these men were probably just desperate, that the frontier was hard on everyone. "Pretty little thing, all alone?" another man asked, circling around her like a vulture. "I'm not alone," Juliet said, her voice wavering only slightly. "I'm traveling to meet my uncle in Winnetka. He's the new school teacher there, and I'm going to help him establish the school. Perhaps some of you have children who might attend." The men burst into laughter, and Rusty cursed under his breath, reaching for the rifle he kept under his seat. But before he could grab it, a shot rang out across the desert scrub, kicking up dust 3 inches from the leader's boot. "Step away from the lady," a voice called out, deep and steady as bedrock. Juliet turned to see a man on horseback, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. He sat tall in the saddle, a rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed skyward but ready to drop and aim in a heartbeat. As he rode closer, she could make out more details. A weathered hat pulled low, a jaw shadowed with several days of stubble, and eyes the color of steel that swept over the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had faced danger too many times to be impressed by it. "Griffin Thorne," the leader spat. "This ain't your business." "You're blocking the road to town," Griffin said, his horse walking forward at an easy pace that somehow seemed more threatening than a charge. "That makes it my business. I'm deputy there, in case you forgot." "Deputy," one of the other men muttered. "Since when?" "Since last month. Now move along before I remember all the outstanding warrants I've seen with your faces on them." The leader's hand twitched toward his gun, but Griffin's rifle had already dropped, the barrel now pointed directly at the man's chest. The movement had been so fast Juliet had barely seen it. "Don't," Griffin said quietly. "Just don't." For a long moment nobody moved. Juliet found she was holding her breath, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Then the leader spat in the dust and jerked his head toward his men. "This ain't over, Thorne." "It never is with you, Calhoun. Get moving." The men mounted their horses and rode off toward the hills, throwing back dark looks, but not willing to challenge a man with Griffin Thorne's reputation. Juliet had no idea what that reputation was, but she could see it written in the way he held himself, in the absolute certainty that he would shoot if he had to and sleep just fine afterward. When the dust settled, Griffin finally lowered his rifle and looked at Juliet properly for the first time. She felt the impact of that gaze like a physical thing, those gray eyes taking in everything about her. The traveling dress that was too fine for this rough country, the way she stood with her shoulders back despite her fear, the canteen still lying in the dirt where Calhoun had dropped it. "You offered them water," he said, "and it wasn't a question." "They looked thirsty," Juliet replied, lifting her chin. They looked like road agents who stopped stagecoaches and robbed them blind, sometimes worse. Griffin swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. Up close, he was even more imposing, easily 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and the kind of lean strength that came from hard work, not leisure. "You must be the schoolteacher's niece we've been expecting. Juliet Sterling, and your deputy Thorne. Just Griffin is fine." He picked up her canteen, dusted it off, and handed it back to her. Their fingers brushed, and Juliet felt a strange jolt run through her, different from the revulsion she had felt when Calhoun touched her. Griffin's hands were calloused and scarred, but there was something solid about them, something that made her feel safer than she had since leaving Boston 3 weeks ago. "Your uncle is waiting in town. We should get moving before Calhoun decides to circle back with more men." Rusty was already climbing back up to the driver's seat, muttering about foolish Eastern girls who didn't know a rattlesnake from a rope. Juliet felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and something else, a growing realization that perhaps she had been naive about what the frontier would be like. "Thank you," she said to Griffin, meaning it with her whole heart. "You saved us." "Just doing my job, Miss Sterling." But his eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer than necessary, and she saw something flicker in them, something that might have been concern or might have been interest. Then he turned away and mounted his horse in one smooth motion. "Stay in the coach until we reach town. And Miss Sterling, out here, kindness is a fine quality, but you need to pair it with caution. Not every man deserves your trust." He rode ahead to scout the road, and Juliet climbed back into the coach, her mind churning with thoughts she couldn't quite organize. The other passengers, a married couple and an older woman, all stared at her with expressions ranging from disapproval to pity. "Your lucky Deputy Thorne was riding patrol today," the older woman said. "Those were Calhoun's men. They've robbed 6 coaches in the past 2 months, and they don't leave witnesses who can identify them." Juliet's stomach dropped. "Oh. O is right," the woman continued, not unkindly. "My dear, I know you Eastern girls come out here with all sorts of romantic notions about the West, but this is a hard land. You can't trust people just because they look like they need help. Half the outlaws in California would slit your throat for the shoes on your feet." "I didn't know," Juliet whispered. The married woman reached over and patted her hand. "You do now. Learn from it and be more careful. Your uncle is a good man, from what I hear, but even he can't protect you if you go handing out kindness to every scoundrel you meet." The rest of the ride into Winnetka passed in silence, with Juliet staring out the window and watching Griffin straight back as he rode ahead. She felt foolish and young and utterly unprepared for this harsh land she had been so excited to explore. Back in Boston, she had imagined the West as a place of opportunity and adventure, where people worked together to build something new. The reality was turning out to be much more complicated and dangerous than she had anticipated. Winnetka itself was a surprise. She had expected a rough mining camp or a collection of tents, but instead found a real town with wooden buildings lining a main street, a church with a proper steeple, and what looked like a decent hotel. The town sat in a valley between dry hills, with a creek running along its eastern edge that probably explained why people had settled here in the first place. It was late afternoon, and the street was busy with people finishing their day's business, cowboys and miners mixing with more respectable-looking merchants and their families. The stagecoach pulled up in front of a building marked General Store and Post Office, and Juliet saw a tall, thin man with graying hair hurrying toward them. Her Uncle Thomas. "Juliet." He reached up to help her down, his face creased with worry. "Thank God you're safe." "We heard there was trouble on the road." "Deputy Thorne handled it," Juliet said, finding her legs a bit unsteady as she stepped onto solid ground. "Uncle Thomas, I'm so glad to see you." They embraced, and she felt some of her fear and embarrassment melt away. Her uncle had always been her favorite relative, the one who encouraged her love of learning and her desire to do something meaningful with her life. When he had written to say he was taking a position as schoolteacher in California and needed her help, she had jumped at the chance, despite her mother's protests. Griffin dismounted nearby, tying his horse to the rail. Thomas released Juliet and extended his hand to the deputy. "Griffin, I can't thank you enough. When we heard Calhoun's gang was working that stretch of road, I was worried sick. Your niece is safe, that's what matters." Griffin's eyes met Juliet's again, and she saw that flicker of concern once more. "Though she needs to learn that not everyone out here means well." "I made a mistake," Juliet said, her voice firmer than she felt. "But I learned from my mistakes, Deputy Thorne. I won't make that one again." Something that might have been approval crossed his face. "Good. Thomas, make sure she understands how things work out here before she gets into trouble she can't get out of." "I will, I promise." Thomas put his arm around Juliet's shoulders. "Come, my dear. Let me show you our new home. It's not much, but it's comfortable enough." As they walked away, Juliet couldn't help glancing back at Griffin. He was talking to another man now, his attention apparently already moved on from her and her foolish mistake. But she found she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had faced down those outlaws without a trace of fear, the absolute certainty in his voice when he told them to move along, the unexpected gentleness with which he had returned her canteen. The schoolhouse and the attached living quarters were indeed modest, but they were clean and well-maintained. Thomas had clearly been working hard to make the place suitable for a young woman's presence, adding curtains to the windows and a proper bed in the small room that would be hers. "I'm sorry it's not what you're used to," he said, watching her take in the simple furnishings. "It's perfect," Juliet assured him, and she meant it. After the scare on the road, having a safe place to sleep felt like luxury. "When do we start teaching?" "Monday, if you're up to it. We have about 20 students enrolled so far, ages 6 to 14. Some of the older boys only come when their families can spare them from work, but we take what we can get." Thomas sat down heavily in one of the 2 chairs at the small table. "Juliet, about what happened today. Griffin is right. You need to be more careful. This isn't Boston. People out here are harder, more desperate. Some of them have nothing to lose." "I understand that now," Juliet said, sitting across from him. "But Uncle Thomas, I don't want to become suspicious of everyone." "Surely there must be a way to be both kind and careful. That's the challenge, isn't it?" Thomas smiled sadly. "I've been here 6 months and I'm still learning that balance myself. The people of Winnetka are good folk, for the most part. They work hard, they support each other, they want their children to have better opportunities than they did. But there are also men like Calhoun and his gang who prey on anyone they see as weak. Griffin Thorne is one of the few men keeping them in check." "What's his story?" Juliet asked, trying to sound casual. "He seems very capable." "He is. Griffin came to Winnetka about 2 years ago working as a ranch hand, but he has a past as a lawman, and when our sheriff needed a deputy, he asked Griffin to take the position. He's only been wearing the badge for a month, like he said, but everyone knows he's the real authority in town. The sheriff is getting old, and frankly, he's not suited for dealing with men like Calhoun." "Is Griffin married?" The question was out before Juliet could stop herself, and she felt her cheeks heat up at her uncle's knowing look. "No, he's not. And before you get any ideas, my dear, Griffin Thorne is not the kind of man who settles down easily. He's been through something that left him hard inside, though he doesn't talk about it. Every woman in town with a daughter of marriageable age has tried to catch his attention, but he keeps to himself mostly. I wasn't getting any ideas, Juliet protested, though she knew it was a lie. There had been something in the way Griffin looked at her, a connection she had felt despite their brief encounter. Or maybe she was just being foolish again, reading things into a situation that weren't really there. That night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the California night, Juliet thought about everything that had happened. She had been so confident when she left Boston, so sure that her education and good intentions would be enough to make a difference in this new place. Now she understood that the frontier required different skills, different instincts. She would have to learn and learn quickly if she wanted to survive and accomplish anything meaningful. And she would have to learn more about Griffin Thorne, the man who had saved her life, and then told her she was too trusting. Because despite his warning, despite the danger she had been in, all she could think about was the way his gray eyes had looked at her, as if he saw something worth protecting. The next morning was Sunday, and Thomas insisted they attend church services. The church was packed, which surprised Juliet until she realized it was probably the main social event of the week. She felt every eye on her as they walked down the aisle, heard the whispers following them. The new school teacher's niece, the one who had tried to give water to outlaws, the foolish Eastern girl, she held her head high and ignored them all. The service was led by a kind-faced minister named Reverend Walsh, who spoke about grace and forgiveness in a voice that actually seemed to mean it. Juliet tried to focus on his words, but she found her attention wandering to the back of the church, where she had spotted Griffin Thorne sitting alone in the last pew. He was cleaned up, his hair still damp from washing, wearing a white shirt and vest that made him look almost civilized. But there was still that air of danger about him, that sense that he was always watching, always ready for trouble. Several women turned to look at him during the service, some with interest, others with what looked like concern or disapproval. He ignored them all, his eyes fixed on the minister or sometimes drifting to the window, as if he would rather be outside. After the service, there was a social hour outside where people mingled and exchanged gossip. Juliet was immediately surrounded by curious townspeople wanting to meet her and ask about Boston and her journey west. She answered their questions as politely as she could, but she felt overwhelmed by the attention and the thinly veiled judgment she heard in some of their voices. "Don't mind them," a young woman about Juliet's age said, appearing at her elbow with a kind smile. "They're just bored and hungry for something new to talk about. I'm Mary Peterson. My father owns the general store, Juliet Sterling. It's nice to meet someone friendly." "Oh, they're friendly enough, just nosy and protective of their town." Mary glanced around and lowered her voice. "I heard about what happened with Calhoun's gang. That must have been terrifying." "It was," Juliet admitted, "though mostly because I didn't realize I was in danger until Deputy Thorne showed up. Griffin has a way of appearing when he's needed. He's saved this town more than once since taking the badge." Mary's expression grew thoughtful. "He's a good man, though a lonely one. I wish he'd let people get closer to him." Before Juliet could respond, a commotion near the church steps drew everyone's attention. A woman was shouting, her voice shrill with anger and fear. "He's gone. Someone took him in the night." Reverend Walsh hurried over, trying to calm her. "Mrs. Chen, please tell us what happened." "My son, Daniel. He was sleeping in his bed last night, and this morning he's gone. The window was open and there were tracks outside. Someone took him." The woman dissolved into tears, and several other women rushed to comfort her. Juliet felt her heart clench with sympathy. She looked around for Griffin and saw him already moving through the crowd, his face set in grim lines. "When did you last see him?" he asked Mrs. Chen, his voice gentle despite his harsh appearance. "Last night, around 9 o'clock. I checked on him before I went to bed and he was sleeping. This morning, gone." She grabbed Griffin's arm. "You have to find him. He's only 12 years old. Please." "I'll find him," Griffin promised, and the absolute certainty in his voice seemed to calm the woman slightly. "Let me look at those tracks. Don't let anyone near your house until I've examined the scene." He strode off toward the edge of town, and Juliet found herself following without really thinking about it. Thomas called after her, but she pretended not to hear. A child was missing. Surely she could help somehow. Griffin was crouched beside a window at a small house, examining the ground with intense concentration. He looked up as Juliet approached, and she saw irritation flash across his face. "Miss Sterling, this isn't a good place for you right now. I want to help. I'm good with children, and if Daniel is scared, he might respond better to a woman's voice. If I find him, I'll keep that in mind. Now please go back to the church where it's safe." "You think whoever took him might still be nearby?" Griffin stood, dusting off his hands. "I think someone climbed through this window and either convinced Daniel to leave or carried him out. The tracks head west toward the hills. That's not safe territory, and it's definitely not a place for a schoolteacher. I'm not just a schoolteacher. I'm a person who cares about what happens to the children in this town." "That's admirable, but it doesn't change the fact that you'd be a liability out there. I need to move fast, and I can't do that while worrying about keeping you safe." His words stung, partly because they were true. Juliet had no experience tracking people or navigating rough country, but she hated feeling useless, hated that her instinct to help was being dismissed as foolish sentiment. "Then teach me," she said. "Not right now, obviously, but later. Teach me how to protect myself, how to be useful instead of a liability. I meant what I said yesterday. I learned from my mistakes." Griffin studied her for a long moment, those gray eyes searching her face for something. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right. When I get back, we'll talk about it. But right now, I need you to go back to your uncle and stay inside until I return with Daniel. You're sure you'll find him?" "I'm sure I'll try my best. That's all anyone can promise out here." He headed to the small stable behind the church where his horse was kept, moving with purposeful speed. Juliet watched him ride out toward the hills, and then reluctantly returned to where Thomas was waiting with a worried expression. "You shouldn't have followed him," her uncle said. "Griffin knows what he's doing." "I know, but I can't just stand by and do nothing when someone needs help." "That's because you have a good heart, Juliet. But you need to learn when helping and when staying out of the way is the best contribution you can make." They spent the rest of the day at the schoolhouse, preparing lessons for the week ahead, but Juliet couldn't concentrate. She kept thinking about Daniel Chen, hoping he was all right, hoping Griffin would find him before something terrible happened. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. It was nearly sunset when they heard horses outside and voices calling out. Juliet rushed to the window and saw Griffin riding down the main street with a small boy sitting in front of him in the saddle. Daniel Chen, dirty and tear-streaked but alive. Relief flooded through Juliet so powerfully her knees went weak. She and Thomas hurried outside along with what seemed like half the town. Mrs. Chen was sobbing with joy as Griffin lifted her son down and into her arms. "He's all right," Griffin said, his voice carrying to the gathered crowd. He decided to run away because some older boys were bullying him. He didn't realize how dangerous it was to go into the hills alone at night. "I'm sorry, Mama," Daniel cried, clinging to his mother. "I'm so sorry." "We'll deal with the bullying," Thomas said firmly. "No child should feel they need to run away from this town. Daniel, you're safe now and you're going to stay safe." Griffin dismounted, looking exhausted. There was a fresh cut on his cheek and his shirt was torn, suggesting the rescue hadn't been as simple as he made it sound. Juliet wanted to go to him to thank him properly, but he was already heading toward the sheriff's office, clearly wanting to avoid the attention and gratitude. She caught up with him halfway there, slightly out of breath. "Deputy Thorne. Griffin. Wait, please." He stopped and turned, one eyebrow raised. "Miss Sterling, I wanted to thank you for finding Daniel, for being the kind of man who doesn't give up when someone is in trouble." "It's my job," he said, but she could hear the weariness in his voice, could see the weight of responsibility in the set of his shoulders. "It's more than that. You could have given up, assumed he'd wandered off and would find his way back. But you didn't. You tracked him for hours and brought him home safe." She reached out and gently touched his arm, feeling the muscle tense beneath her fingers. "Thank you." Griffin looked down at her hand on his arm and something shifted in his expression, a crack in that hard exterior. Daniel was lucky. He could have run into mountain lions or snakes or fallen and broken a leg. Kids don't understand how dangerous this country is. "Neither do foolish Eastern girls, apparently," Juliet said with a rueful smile. "You're not foolish. Naive, maybe, but that's different. Foolish people don't learn from their mistakes. I think you will." He hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said about teaching you. If you really want to learn how to handle yourself out here, I'll help you. But it won't be easy and you'll have to follow my instructions exactly." "I will. I promise. Then meet me behind the livery stable tomorrow afternoon around 4. Wear clothes you can move in, not those fancy dresses." "I don't have any other clothes." Griffin almost smiled, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Then I guess you'll need to visit the general store and get some proper working clothes. Tell Mary Peterson I sent you. She'll know what you need." He tipped his hat to her and continued on his way, leaving Juliet standing in the street with her heart beating faster than it should have been. She was going to learn from Griffin Thorne. She was going to prove that she could adapt to this harsh land, that she could be more than just a naive Eastern girl who trusted the wrong people. And maybe, just maybe, she would learn more about the man behind the badge. The one whose eyes held shadows but who risked his life without hesitation for a scared 12-year-old boy. Monday morning, Juliet threw herself into teaching with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself. The students ranged from 6-year-old Emma Watson, who could barely write her name, to 14-year-old Jacob Miller, who was nearly as tall as Thomas and clearly uncomfortable being in school when he could be working. But they were all eager to learn, and Juliet found herself falling in love with each of them. By the time 4 o'clock came around, she was exhausted but exhilarated. She had changed into the split riding skirt and sturdy blouse Mary Peterson had helped her pick out, feeling strange and exposed without her usual layers of petticoats and corset. But Mary had assured her these were practical clothes for a woman who needed to ride or work on the frontier. Griffin was already waiting at the livery stable when she arrived, leaning against the fence with his arms crossed. His eyes swept over her new outfit, and she thought she saw approval in his expression. "Better," he said. "Those fancy dresses are fine for teaching, but they'll get you killed if you need to move fast. Can you ride a little? I took lessons in Boston. Riding in a park and riding out here are two different things, but we'll start with the basics." He led her to a gentle mare. "This is Rosie. She's patient with beginners. Let's see you mount up." The next hour was humbling. Juliet had thought she knew how to ride, but Griffin showed her how wrong she was. He taught her how to really sit in the saddle, how to guide the horse with subtle movements, how to stay balanced over rough terrain. He was a patient teacher but demanding, never accepting less than her full effort. "Why are you doing this?" Juliet asked during a brief rest. "Teaching me, I mean. You could be doing something else with your afternoon." Griffin was quiet for a moment, watching the horizon with that ever-present vigilance. "Because you remind me of someone who was too trusting, too kind for this world. I couldn't protect her, but maybe I can help you learn to protect yourself." "Who was she?" "My sister, Emily. She died 3 years ago back in Texas." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Juliet could hear the pain underneath. She believed the best in people, even when they showed her otherwise. A man she thought was courting her honorably turned out to be wanted for murder. When the law came for him, he took her hostage. She didn't survive. "Oh, Griffin, I'm so sorry. I was the sheriff in that town. I should have seen what he was, should have warned her. But I was too focused on other things, and by the time I realized the danger, it was too late." He finally looked at her, and the anguish in his eyes nearly broke her heart. "I quit wearing a badge after that. Came out here to start over, to be just a ranch hand with no responsibilities. But Sheriff Cooper needed help, and I couldn't say no. And then I met you, offering water to outlaws like they were thirsty travelers, and I saw Emily all over again." Juliet understood now why he had been so harsh with her, why he seemed determined to teach her caution. She wasn't just some foolish girl to him. She was a second chance, a way to atone for failing his sister. "I'm not Emily," she said gently. "And what happened to her wasn't your fault. You can't control other people's actions, only your own. I know that up here." Griffin tapped his head. "But knowing something and feeling it are different things. Emily trusted the wrong man, and it cost her everything. I won't let that happen to you if I can help it. Then teach me, not just how to ride, but everything you think I need to know. I want to understand this place, to really belong here. And I want to make sure I never put myself or anyone else in danger because of my ignorance." For the first time since she had met him, Griffin truly smiled. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, more approachable. "You've got determination, I'll give you that. All right, Miss Sterling. I'll teach you everything I know, but you have to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that you'll always think before you act. That you'll consider the worst possible outcome before you trust someone. Not to make you cynical or afraid, but to keep you safe. I promise." They shook hands on it, and Juliet felt the now familiar jolt when their skin touched. Griffin felt it too. She could see it in the way his eyes widened slightly, in how he held her hand just a moment longer than necessary before pulling away. Over the next 2 weeks, Juliet's life fell into a pattern. She taught school in the mornings and early afternoons, working with Thomas to give these frontier children the education they deserved. Then she would change clothes and meet Griffin for lessons in survival, riding, and what he called situational awareness. He taught her how to read the land, how to spot potential danger, how to handle a gun, though he made her practice for hours with an unloaded weapon before he would let her fire a single shot. "A gun is a last resort," he told her firmly. "The best way to survive is to avoid trouble in the first place. But if trouble finds you anyway, you need to know how to defend yourself." He also told her stories about the frontier, about the people who lived here and the forces that shaped them. She learned about the cattle drives that brought cowboys through town, the miners who worked claims in the surrounding hills hoping to strike it rich, the farmers who struggled to coax crops from the dry soil. She learned about the Apache who sometimes raided from the south, the bandits who preyed on lone travelers, the harsh weather that could turn deadly without warning. But more than information, Juliet learned about Griffin himself. She discovered that beneath his harsh exterior was a man of deep integrity and surprising gentleness. He was kind to children and respectful to women, even the saloon girls whom other respectable men ignored. He never drank more than a single beer, and he never gambled or visited the brothel at the edge of town. He spent his free time reading books borrowed from Thomas or working with horses, which seemed to relax him in a way nothing else did. And slowly, carefully, Juliet felt herself falling in love with him. It wasn't something she intended or even wanted at first. Griffin Thorne was complicated, damaged by his past, and devoted to a job that could get him killed any day. He was nothing like the refined Boston gentleman her mother had hoped she would marry. But there was something about the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Something in how he always positioned himself between her and potential danger that made her heart race and her thoughts scatter. She thought he might be falling for her too, but Griffin was careful to maintain a professional distance during their lessons. He never touched her unnecessarily, never said anything that could be construed as romantic interest. But sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, and she would wonder what he was thinking. The answer came on a Tuesday afternoon in her third week in Winnetka. They were practicing shooting at targets Griffin had set up in a clearing outside town, and Juliet had just managed to hit the center 3 times in a row. "Better," Griffin said, that approval in his voice that always made her feel warm inside. "You're learning fast. I have a good teacher. You're doing the work, I'm just pointing you in the right direction." He took the gun from her and set it aside, then turned to face her fully. "Juliet, I need to tell you something." The use of her first name startled her. He always called her Miss Sterling during their lessons, maintaining that formal distance. Her heart started to pound. "What is it? This, us, these lessons?" He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable in a way she had never seen before. "I told myself I was doing this to help you stay safe, to make up for failing Emily. And that's true, but it's not the whole truth anymore." "What's the whole truth?" "That I look forward to these afternoons more than anything else in my life. That I think about you when I'm on patrol, wondering what you're teaching the kids, imagining you smiling at some joke Thomas made. That I have feelings for you I have no business having." Juliet felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Griffin, let me finish, please." He took a step closer, his gray eyes intense on her face. "You're young and educated and from a good family. You deserve better than a broken-down deputy with more ghosts than prospects, but I can't seem to stop myself from wanting you anyway. From wanting to be the man who makes you smile, who keeps you safe, who gets to spend his life with you." "You think you're not good enough for me?" Juliet asked, finding her voice at last. "Griffin, you're the best man I've ever met. You're honest and brave and kind. You care about people, even when it costs you. You saved my life and Daniel's life and probably dozens of others I don't even know about. How could you possibly think you're not good enough?" "Because I couldn't save Emily. Because I have nightmares about that day and probably always will. Because this job could get me killed, and I don't know if I could survive losing someone I love again." "But you could," Juliet said, moving closer to him until they were almost touching. "Because you're still here, still fighting for people, still trying to make a difference. You survived losing Emily, even though it broke your heart. And I'm not asking you to forget her or stop grieving for her. I would never ask that. What are you asking? For a chance. For both of us to have a chance at something good." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palm. "I'm falling in love with you, Griffin Thorne. I have been almost since the moment you rode up and saved me from my own foolish trust. And I think you feel the same way about me." "I do," he breathed. "God help me, I do." Then he was kissing her, and Juliet felt the world narrow down to just this moment, just the two of them. His lips were warm and gentle despite the urgency she could feel beneath them, and when his arms came around her, she felt safer and more cherished than she ever had in her life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Griffin rested his forehead against hers. "This is crazy," he murmured. "We've only known each other 3 weeks. The frontier makes people move fast. Isn't that what everyone keeps telling me? That's usually about things like building houses or staking claims, not falling in love. Why should love be any different?" "When you know, you know." Griffin pulled back enough to look at her properly, his eyes searching her face. "You're sure about this? About me? Because Juliet, if we do this, if we let ourselves have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to make it permanent. I'm not a man who loves lightly." "Neither am I. And yes, I'm sure. More sure than I've been about anything in my life." He kissed her again, slower this time, and Juliet felt herself melting into him. When they finally headed back to town as the sun was setting, they were holding hands and Juliet couldn't stop smiling. Thomas took the news of their courtship with surprising calm, though he did insist on having a serious talk with Griffin about his intentions. Whatever was said during that conversation, Thomas emerged satisfied and gave Juliet his blessing. "Just be careful," he told her that night. "Not about Griffin, he's a good man, but about how public you make this at first. Some people in town had hopes of matchmaking Griffin with their daughters, and they won't be happy to see an Eastern outsider catching his attention." He was right. When word spread that Griffin Thorne was courting the new schoolteacher's niece, reaction was mixed. Some people were genuinely happy for them, including Mary Peterson, who hugged Juliet and declared she had been rooting for this from the start. But others were less pleased, and Juliet started hearing whispers when she walked down the street. Comments about Eastern girls who thought they were too good for local men, or about Griffin wasting his time on someone who would probably run back to civilization at the first real hardship. Juliet tried to ignore the gossip and focus on what mattered: her students, her uncle, and Griffin. They continued their lessons, though now they were punctuated with kisses and quiet conversations about their hopes for the future. Griffin talked about eventually buying a small ranch, a place where he could raise horses and maybe cattle. Juliet talked about expanding the school, maybe one day adding a lending library for the whole town. "You think big," Griffin said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset from a hill overlooking Winnetka. "Is that a bad thing?" "No, I like it. Emily used to think big too. She wanted to start an orphanage, a place where kids without families could have a real home." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "She would have liked you." "I wish I could have met her. Me too." He squeezed her hand. "She used to tell me I was too serious, that I needed to find someone who would make me laugh. I never thought I would after she died. But then you came along, offering water to outlaws and arguing with me about wanting to help search for Daniel, and I realized Emily was right. I needed someone exactly like you. Someone too trusting for the harsh frontier. Someone whose trust makes me want to be worthy of it. Someone whose kindness reminds me why I do this job, why I keep fighting for people even when it seems hopeless." He turned to her, his gray eyes soft in the fading light. "You make me better, Juliet. You make me want to be the man you see when you look at me." "You already are that man," she told him. "You always have been. You just needed someone to help you see it." They sat together until the stars came out, talking about everything and nothing, and Juliet felt a contentment she had never known before. This harsh frontier land had seemed so frightening when she first arrived, but now it felt like home. Because Griffin was here, and wherever he was felt like where she belonged. But their happiness was shattered 2 days later when Calhoun and his gang rode into Winnetka in broad daylight. Juliet was in the schoolhouse, teaching a geography lesson, when she heard shouting and gunfire from the main street. Her first instinct was to run outside, but she remembered Griffin's lessons about assessing danger first. "Everyone get down on the floor," she told her students. keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. "Thomas, bar the door." Her uncle moved quickly, dropping the heavy bar into place while Juliet herded the children away from the windows. Through the glass, she could see armed men on horseback riding up and down the street, shooting into the air and terrorizing the townspeople. "It's Calhoun," Thomas said grimly. "They're robbing the bank." Juliet's mind went immediately to Griffin. Where was he? Was he trying to stop them? Please, God, let him be safe. The raid seemed to last forever, but was probably only 10 minutes. The children were crying, and Juliet did her best to comfort them while keeping one eye on the window. She saw the robbers emerge from the bank carrying sacks that must have held money, saw them shoot out windows and laugh at the people cowering in doorways. Then she saw Griffin, running down the street with his gun drawn, and her heart nearly stopped. "No," she whispered. "Griffin, don't." But he was already taking cover behind a water trough, already aiming at the robbers. His shot took down one of them, the man falling from his horse with a cry. The others wheeled around, returning fire, and Griffin had to duck as bullets splintered the wood near his head. Sheriff Cooper appeared from the direction of his office, also shooting, and suddenly the street was a war zone. The children screamed, and Juliet pulled them all toward the back of the room, putting as many walls as possible between them and the flying bullets. More shots, more shouting. Then the sound of horses galloping away fast, and gradually the gunfire stopped. Juliet waited, counting her heartbeats, until she was sure the danger had passed. Then she carefully lifted the bar from the door and peered outside. The street was a mess of broken glass and scattered goods from stores whose windows had been shot out. Several people were emerging from buildings, looking shaken but unharmed. And there, in the middle of the street, was Griffin, standing over the body of the robber he had shot. Relief flooded through Juliet so powerfully she nearly collapsed. He was alive. He was all right. "Stay here," she told Thomas and ran out into the street. Griffin looked up as she approached, and she saw the strain on his face, the adrenaline still coursing through him. "Juliet, get back inside. There might be more of them." "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine. But we need to organize a posse. They got away with nearly $5,000 from the bank." Sheriff Cooper limped over, holding his arm where blood was seeping through his shirt. "Griffin's right. We need to go after them before the trail goes cold." "You need a doctor," Griffin told him. "I'll organize the posse. Get that arm looked at." Within an hour, Griffin had assembled 10 men willing to ride after Calhoun's gang. Juliet watched as he prepared, checking his weapons, filling his canteen, speaking quietly to his horse as he tightened the saddle. "Be careful," she told him, unable to stop herself from clutching his arm. "Please, Griffin, come back safe." "I will." He cupped her face with one hand, and right there in front of half the town, he kissed her. "I promise I'll come back to you, but I have to do this. If we let Calhoun get away with this, he'll just keep coming back. I know, I understand. Just please be safe." He kissed her once more, then mounted up and led the posse out of town at a gallop. Juliet watched until they disappeared into the hills, then turned back to the schoolhouse where frightened children needed reassurance and comfort. The next 3 days were the longest of Juliet's life. She taught her classes, helped clean up the damage from the raid, and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong out in those harsh hills. She knew Griffin was capable, but she also knew Calhoun was dangerous and desperate. The thought of losing him, of having finally found love only to have it ripped away, was almost more than she could bear. On the 3rd night, she was sitting with Thomas after dinner when they heard horses approaching. She ran to the window and saw the posse riding back into town, tired and dusty, but apparently intact. And there, at the front, was Griffin. Juliet didn't care about propriety or what people might think. She ran out into the street and threw herself into his arms as soon as he dismounted. He caught her, holding her tight, and she felt him shaking with exhaustion and relief. "Did you get them?" she asked against his chest. "Most of them. Calhoun got away, but we recovered the money and captured 4 of his men. He won't find it easy to recruit replacements after this." Griffin pulled back enough to look at her. "I kept my promise. I came back to you. Don't ever scare me like that again." "I can't promise that. This is my job, Juliet. There will be other dangerous men, other times when I have to ride out not knowing if I'll come back. Can you live with that?" She looked up at him, at this man who had saved her life and taught her to save herself, who had trusted her with his darkest pain and accepted her despite her naivety. Could she live with the constant fear that he might not come home? It would be easier to love a shopkeeper or a farmer, someone whose work didn't involve facing down armed outlaws, but she didn't love a shopkeeper or a farmer. She loved Griffin Thorne with all his scars and shadows and stubborn sense of duty. "Yes," she said firmly, "I can live with it. Because the alternative is living without you, and that's not something I ever want to do." The relief in his eyes told her she had said exactly the right thing. "Then I have something to ask you, and I don't want to wait. Life is too short and too uncertain out here for long courtships and careful planning." He took her hands in his. "Juliet Sterling, will you marry me? Will you let me spend whatever time we're given trying to be worthy of your trust?" Tears filled her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Yes. Yes. 1,000 times yes." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Juliet wore a simple white dress that Mary Peterson had helped her make, and Griffin wore his best shirt and vest, looking nervous and proud at the same time. Thomas gave her away with tears in his eyes, and Reverend Walsh performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. When Griffin kissed her as his wife, Juliet felt like her heart might burst with happiness. This rough, dangerous land had seemed so frightening 4 weeks ago, but now it was the place where she had found her purpose and her love. She thought about the scared girl who had offered water to outlaws, and she could hardly recognize herself. Griffin had been right. She had learned from her mistakes. She had learned to be careful without losing her kindness, to be strong without becoming hard. They moved into a small house on the edge of town that Griffin had been renting, and Juliet threw herself into making it a home. She continued teaching, and Griffin continued his work as deputy, but now they had each other to come home to. On quiet evenings, they would sit together on their porch, watching the sun set over the hills and talking about their day, about their hopes, about the life they were building together. It wasn't always easy. Griffin had nightmares about Emily sometimes, waking up calling her name, and Juliet learned to hold him through them, to remind him that he hadn't failed, that he had done everything he could. And there were times when Griffin came home with new bruises or cuts from dealing with troublemakers, and Juliet had to face the reality that she might someday lose him. But the love between them only grew stronger. Griffin was true to his word about being worthy of her trust. He was faithful and devoted, always making her feel cherished and protected without making her feel weak or incapable. And Juliet proved she could handle the harsh realities of frontier life, becoming a respected member of the community, someone people turned to for advice and support. 6 months after their wedding, Sheriff Cooper announced he was retiring and moving back east to live with his daughter. The town council met to discuss who should replace him, and the decision was unanimous. Griffin Thorne would become the new sheriff of Winnetka. "I don't know if I want the job," Griffin told Juliet that night. "Sheriff Cooper is old and ready to rest. I'm 28. I could be doing this for the next 30 years. Is it the job itself you're worried about or the responsibility? Both. As deputy, I could focus on keeping people safe. As sheriff, I'll have to deal with politics and budgets and all sorts of things I never wanted to think about. Then say no, Juliet said simply. If you don't want the job, turn it down. We'll be fine on a deputy salary, or you could go back to ranch work if that's what would make you happy. Griffin looked at her with such love it took her breath away. How did I get so lucky to find you? I offered water to outlaws, and you saved me from my own foolish trust. After that, we were inevitable. He laughed, and the sound warmed her heart. He laughed more now, smiled more, let himself be happy in a way he hadn't allowed before they met. You're right, we were. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I think I'll take the job. Not because I want the power or prestige, but because this town needs someone who cares about the people in it, not just the laws. And because Emily wanted to make a difference in the world. Maybe this is how I honor her memory, by protecting people the way I couldn't protect her. Then that's what you'll do, and I'll be right beside you every step of the way. Griffin became sheriff the next week, and he immediately set about making changes. He hired 2 new deputies, one of them a young Mexican man named Carlos who had grown up in the area and knew the land better than anyone. He organized regular patrols to make the roads safer for travelers. And he worked with the town council to establish a fund to help families who lost breadwinners to violence or accidents. Juliet expanded the school, adding an evening class for adults who wanted to learn to read and write. She started a lending library in one corner of the schoolhouse, collecting books from anyone willing to donate them. And she began writing articles about frontier life for newspapers back east, trying to give people a more realistic picture of what the West was really like, the hardships and the dangers, but also the community and the hope. Their first wedding anniversary arrived, and Griffin surprised her with a small party at their house. All their friends came, bearing gifts and good wishes. Mary Peterson brought a cake she had spent 2 days decorating. Thomas gave them a beautiful set of books he had ordered from San Francisco. Carlos and his wife brought a hand-woven blanket that Juliet immediately fell in love with. As Juliet looked around at all these people who had become her family, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. A year ago, she had been a naive girl from Boston who thought kindness alone could solve any problem. Now she was a woman of the frontier, still kind but also strong, still trusting but also careful, still hopeful but also realistic about the challenges life could bring. And she had Griffin, her husband, her partner, her love, the man who had seen her at her most foolish and had chosen to teach her instead of dismiss her. The man who carried the weight of his sister's death, but hadn't let it turn him bitter or cruel. The man who made her feel safe and cherished and capable all at once. Late that night, after everyone had gone home and they were lying in bed together, Griffin pulled her close and whispered, I have something to tell you. What is it? I'm ready to start talking about a family, if you are. Juliet's heart leaped. They had discussed children before, but Griffin had always said he needed more time to make sure the town was stable enough that he could take time for family life. The fact that he was bringing it up now meant he felt secure in his role as sheriff, confident that Winnetka was safe enough to raise children in. I'm ready, she said, threading her fingers through his. I want to have a family with you, Griffin. I want to fill this house with children who know they're loved and safe. They'll be lucky to have you as their mother. You're so good with your students. I've watched you with them, the way you make each one feel special and capable. Our kids will have the best mother in California. And the best father. You'll teach them to be strong and careful, but also kind and fair. You'll teach them that doing what's right matters more than doing what's easy. They made love that night with a new sense of purpose, and 3 months later, Juliet realized she was pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult. Morning sickness lasted well into her 5th month, and the California heat in summer made her feel dizzy and exhausted. But Griffin was wonderful, constantly worried about her but trying not to show it too much, bringing her cool water and fanning her when she felt faint, rubbing her feet when they swelled. "You're hovering," she told him one evening, but she said it with a smile. "I know. I can't help it. You're carrying our child, Juliet. That's the most amazing and terrifying thing I've ever experienced, and I've faced down armed outlaws. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm not going to break. I know that up here." He tapped his head, echoing what he had said about his guilt over Emily so long ago. "But my heart is another matter." Thomas stepped down from teaching in September, saying he was getting too old for the energy required to manage a classroom full of children. He recommended that Juliet take over as the main teacher, with a part-time assistant to help once the baby came. The town council agreed, and Juliet found herself running the school while 6 months pregnant. "You're trying to do too much," Griffin warned her one evening when he found her grading papers at 10 o'clock at night. "I'm fine. The baby's fine. Stop worrying." "It's my job to worry. You're my wife and the mother of my child. Worrying about you is going to be a lifelong occupation." Despite his concerns, both Juliet and the baby remained healthy. In February of 1880, during a rare rainstorm that turned the dusty streets to mud, Juliet went into labor. Griffin immediately became a nervous wreck, pacing outside the bedroom where the midwife and Mary Peterson were helping Juliet, driving poor Thomas to distraction with his constant questions about whether everything was all right. After 10 hours of labor, Juliet gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When the midwife finally let Griffin into the room, he approached the bed like he was walking on sacred ground, his eyes wide with wonder as he looked at his wife and newborn son. "He's perfect," Griffin breathed, carefully taking the tiny bundle when Juliet offered him. "He's absolutely perfect." "Juliet, we made this. We made a person." "We did," she agreed, feeling exhausted but happier than she had ever been. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Griffin said quietly, "What about Samuel?" "Samuel Thomas Thorne, after your uncle who made it possible for you to come here, who brought us together." Thomas, who had been hovering in the doorway, let out a choked sob. "You don't have to do that." "We want to," Juliet said. "You gave me a chance at a new life, Uncle Thomas. Without you, I never would have come to California, never would have met Griffin, never would have this beautiful baby. It's only fitting that he carry your name." So Samuel Thomas Thorne entered the world, and with him came a new chapter in their lives. Griffin proved to be a devoted father, often carrying Samuel in a sling while doing paperwork at the sheriff's office, singing to him in a surprisingly gentle voice, staying up with him at night so Juliet could rest. "You're a natural at this," Juliet told him one evening, watching him rock Samuel to sleep. "I'm terrified I'll do something wrong and ruin him," Griffin admitted. "But I love him so much already. I didn't know it was possible to love someone this much." "That's how I feel about you," Juliet said softly. The years passed, filled with the ordinary joys and challenges of life. Samuel grew into a curious, energetic toddler who loved horses and followed his father around whenever possible. Juliet returned to teaching part-time, with Thomas's help in watching Samuel. Griffin continued as sheriff, making Winnetka one of the safest towns in that part of California. When Samuel was 3, Juliet became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and in 1883 they welcomed a daughter they named Emily Rose Thorne. Griffin cried when he held her for the first time. "Thank you," he whispered to Juliet. Thank you for letting me honor my sister this way." "She deserves to be remembered," Juliet said, watching her husband cradle their daughter with infinite tenderness. "And our Emily will know she's named after someone brave and kind, someone who believed in the goodness of people even when the world gave her reasons not to." Little Emily was as different from Samuel as could be. Where he was energetic and fearless, she was thoughtful and careful. But they adored each other from the start, and watching them play together filled Juliet's heart with joy. Life wasn't always easy. There were still outlaws to deal with, still people who tested Griffin's patience and skills. There were droughts that threatened the town's survival, and harsh winters that made everyone miserable. There were children in Juliet's school who came from difficult homes, and she did her best to give them the support and encouragement they needed. But through it all, Juliet and Griffin had each other. They had built a life together based on trust and love, on the understanding that they were partners in everything. Griffin had become the shield that Juliet's trusting nature deserved, protecting her not by changing who she was, but by teaching her how to protect herself while remaining kind. And Juliet had become Griffin's heart, healing the wounds left by Emily's death, showing him that it was possible to love again, to hope again, to believe that goodness could triumph over darkness. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they sat together on their porch after putting the children to bed, watching the stars come out over the California hills. "You ever regret it?" Griffin asked, taking her hand. "Leaving Boston, coming out here to this rough place?" "Not for a single moment," Juliet said firmly. "This is where I belong. With you, with our children, with this community we've helped build. I was too trusting when I first came here, that's true. But you didn't punish me for that or try to change me into someone hard and suspicious. You just taught me how to be careful while keeping my heart open." "You taught me something too," Griffin said. "You taught me that surviving tragedy doesn't mean closing yourself off from love. That protecting people isn't just about stopping bad things from happening to them, but about creating spaces where good things can grow. That Emily's death wasn't the end of my story, just a hard chapter in a much longer book. What chapter are we in now? The happy one. The one where we get to watch our children grow up, where we get to grow old together, where we get to see Winnetka thrive because people like us chose to stay and make it better." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. The best chapter of all. 2 more children followed in the next years. Another boy they named Daniel, after the child Griffin had rescued in those early days, and finally, another girl they named Grace. Their house was always full of noise and laughter, of muddy boots and scraped knees, of bedtime stories and Sunday dinners with friends. Samuel grew up to be a horse trainer, working with the wild mustangs that roamed the hills. Emily became a teacher like her mother, eventually taking over the school when Juliet retired. Daniel followed his father into law enforcement, becoming deputy under a new sheriff when Griffin finally decided to step down at age 50. And Grace became a doctor, the first woman physician in that part of California, dedicated to bringing modern medicine to frontier communities. Griffin and Juliet watched their children build their own lives with pride and satisfaction. They had given them a solid foundation of love and values, had taught them to be both strong and kind, to stand up for what was right while still treating people with compassion. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole town threw them a celebration. It seemed like everyone in Winnetka turned out to honor the sheriff and schoolteacher who had become pillars of the community. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing, and more food than could possibly be eaten. 25 years, Juliet said to Griffin as they danced together while the sun set. "Can you believe it's been that long?" Feels like yesterday you were offering water to outlaws, and I was wondering what kind of fool would be that trusting. And now you know. The kind of fool who would fall in love with a broken-hearted deputy and spend the next 25 years helping him heal. I'm not sure who did more healing, you or me, Griffin said. You came out here so naive, Juliet. You've become one of the strongest women I know. Because you taught me. You gave me the tools I needed to survive and thrive here. You became the shield my trust deserved. And you gave me a reason to be that shield. You gave me a purpose beyond just surviving, beyond just getting through each day. You gave me love and family and hope. He pulled her closer. I would face down 1,000 cowhounds if it meant getting to spend my life with you. They danced until the stars came out, surrounded by their children and grandchildren who were just starting to appear, by friends who had become family, by a community they had helped shape through their love and dedication. Juliet thought back to that scared girl on the stagecoach, the one who thought kindness alone could change the world. She had learned that kindness needed to be paired with wisdom, that trust needed to be earned, that the harsh frontier demanded strength as well as compassion. But she had learned those lessons without losing the core of who she was, without becoming hard or cynical. And she had learned them from the man who held her now, the one who had seen her at her most vulnerable and had chosen to build her up instead of tearing her down. Griffin Thorne, the cowboy who had become her shield, her partner, her love. The years continued to pass gently. Griffin and Juliet grew older together, their hair turning gray, their steps slowing, but their love never diminishing. They watched Winnetka grow from a rough frontier town into a proper community with paved streets and electric lights, though they sometimes missed the simpler days when everyone knew everyone else. They were blessed with 12 grandchildren in total, each one unique and precious. Samuel's children inherited his love of horses. Emily's became educators and social reformers. Daniel's followed him into law enforcement or medicine like their Aunt Grace. Grace's own children were pioneers in their own ways, pushing boundaries and challenging assumptions about what was possible. Through it all, Griffin and Juliet remained the heart of their family, the ones everyone turned to for advice and wisdom. They had lived through so much together, survived so many challenges, that they had earned the respect and love of everyone who knew them. On a warm spring evening in 1908, 30 years after they had first met, Griffin and Juliet sat together on their porch one last time. Griffin had been ill for several months, his body finally giving out after a lifetime of hard work and constant vigilance. But his mind was still sharp, and his love for Juliet had never wavered. "Tell me the story again," he said, his voice weak but content. "The story of how we met." Juliet smiled, taking his weathered hand in hers. A foolish Eastern girl got off a stagecoach in California and immediately tried to give water to outlaws. A grumpy deputy saved her and then made it his mission to teach her how to survive. She wasn't foolish. She was trusting. There's a difference. He was right to be grumpy. I was in way over my head. But you learned, you adapted, you became the strongest person I knew. Griffin squeezed her hand weakly. "I'm glad I saved you that day, Juliet. It was the best thing I ever did. The best thing you ever did was love me. Was teaching me that trust and caution can coexist, was being the kind of man worthy of the trust I gave you. I tried. God knows I tried." He closed his eyes, breathing shallowly. "Emily would have liked you so much. You're everything she wanted to be, kind but not naive, strong but not hard, hopeful but not foolish. I hope I honored her memory, through our daughter, through the way we raised our children, through the life we built together. You did. We did." He opened his eyes and looked at her with all the love of 3 decades together. "Thank you, Juliet. Thank you for trusting me when I didn't deserve it. Thank you for loving me when I was still broken. Thank you for giving me the family and the life I never thought I could have. Thank you for being my shield, she whispered, tears running down her face. For protecting my trusting heart without destroying it. For showing me that the harsh frontier could also be beautiful. Griffin smiled one last time, then closed his eyes and slipped away peacefully. Juliet held his hand until the morning sun rose, remembering everything they had been through together, grateful for every moment they had shared. The funeral was the largest Winnetka had ever seen. Griffin Thorne had spent 30 years protecting the town, and everyone wanted to pay their respects. His children and grandchildren gathered around Juliet, supporting her through her grief, but she stood tall and dry-eyed during the service. She had already done her crying in private. In public, she wanted to celebrate the man Griffin had been, not mourn what she had lost. Juliet lived another 5 years after Griffin's death, continuing to be active in the community, teaching part-time, spending time with her children and grandchildren. But everyone could see that a part of her was missing, that she was just waiting until it was time to join her beloved husband. On a spring evening in 1913, Juliet passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the family she and Griffin had created. She was buried beside him under a large oak tree on a hill overlooking Winnetka with a simple headstone that read, Juliet Sterling Thorne, teacher, mother, beloved wife. She trusted in the goodness of people and found a man who made that trust his life's work to deserve. Their children made sure their story was preserved, writing it down for future generations. It became a legend in Winnetka, the tale of the trusting Eastern girl and the protective cowboy, the couple who had helped build a community based on both strength and compassion. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew across the California hills, people said you could still feel their presence, still sense the love that had transformed two wounded souls into partners who had changed their corner of the world for the better. Juliet had come to the frontier too trusting for its harsh realities, but Griffin had become the shield her trust deserved. Together, they had proved that love could conquer even the wildest frontier, that kindness paired with wisdom could change lives, and that two people who found each other against all odds could build something beautiful and lasting. Their legacy lived on in their children, their grandchildren, and the community they had helped create. Winnetka remained a place where people looked out for each other, where newcomers were welcomed but taught to be careful, where trust was earned but then fiercely protected. It was everything Juliet and Griffin had hoped to build together. And somewhere beyond the stars, in whatever comes after this life, Juliet Sterling Thorne and Griffin Thorne walked hand in hand, their love eternal, their story complete. She had trusted him from the beginning, even when she didn't know enough to be careful. He had spent their life together proving worthy of that trust, protecting her without diminishing her, strengthening her without hardening her. In the end, that was their greatest achievement, not the children they raised or the community they served, but the love they built together. A love that transformed them both, that made them better than they could have been alone, that proved the harsh frontier could be softened by two hearts beating as one. Their story ended, but their love never did. It lived on in every act of kindness, in every person who chose trust paired with wisdom, in every couple who faced the world's hardships together and came out stronger. Juliet had been too trusting for the harsh frontier, but Griffin had become the shield her trust deserved. And together, they had created something beautiful that would last forever.